Hey, Beck Barnes here. Listen, before we get going in earnest on the Cotton Companion today, I just wanted to say that as the nation approaches its 250th anniversary, we're spotlighting the brands that support U.S. cotton production. That's right, in our upcoming Made in the USA special section in the July issue of Cotton Grower, we're going to be highlighting companies that serve growers and ginners across the cotton belt. It's a great opportunity for you to showcase your brand, if you got one, in front of this audience that drives decisions in the cotton market from the field to the gin. Space is limited on this special opportunity for you to show your pride in America and the American cotton industry. So connect with your cotton grower representatives to secure your spot today. Well, hello out there in the Cotton Belt. Man, we are happy that you're joining us today, wherever you may be out there in the 17 contiguous states that comprise our Cotton Belt here in the United States. And we are coming to you live from the Cotton Companion Studios, the historic Cotton Companion Studios, here the week after Labor Day in Memphis, Tennessee. We know traditionally, right now, here the week after Labor Day, it is hot and heavy planting season for y'all. And the latest USDA crop progress report certainly bears that out. You guys are in the thick of it. The May 24th report says that 53% of the cotton crop has been planted to this point. The far west states, California and Arizona specifically, along with Missouri, kind of curiously, those three lead the way. Each of them have north of 97% of their crop planted already. Texas, understandably, is pulling up the rear. Texas growers have 42% of their seed in the ground at this point there in the Lone Star State. And we all know the situation with rainfall or lack thereof there on the high and rolling plains. Now, here in the Mid South, quite conversely, quite the opposite, we are in the midst of some, I would call it Old Testament level rain. I mean, it's been something. It came down every day last week. So far here this week, we are 3 of 3 in terms of days where it has rained in a row. If you're like me, you start worrying about your yard and the potted plants and your mental health with all this rain. But I know many of y'all are much more practical, and the way your minds work is when you see this much rain, you think, hey, that means more vegetation on the roadside and outside of the field, and that means more hosts for more bug pests. And so that's where our mind is at today. In this episode of the podcast, we are going to hone in on the reigning king of being a pain in our rear end in the cotton belt, and that is the tarnished plant bug. Let's do a quick kind of deep dive into the history of this pest. Indulge me here. This is a pest that is native to North America and made its survival feeding on any wild flowering host plant for, eons, only occasionally started causing localized damage to flowering crops, mostly in vegetables or fruit trees, in the early part of the 20th century. And then in the 1950s, as row crop ag began to introduce pesticides on a broader scale, these plant bugs, they were easily suppressed by the products being used 50 some odd, 60 some odd years ago. Again, they were being suppressed as a byproduct of chemistries that were targeting more troublesome bugs, namely, boll weevil and others. The plant bug was really an afterthought in that time. And then in the 1980s, it became more of a problem. The plant bug did there in the Northeast in alfalfa fields and in apple orchards, where farmers up there started resorting to a little biocontrol. They imported a French wasp that preyed naturally on this plant bug. It was a nice early use of biocontrols from producers up there. But as the boll weevil eradication program closer to home, that program began to see success. And as BT cotton took hold in the coming decades, row crop producers naturally began to reduce their broad spectrum insecticide sprays, which served to flare in a major way the plant bug. It brought it to the forefront here in the cotton belt. Later shifts across the belt further suited the Lygus pest resulting in their current reign as public enemy number one. I myself am recalling doing a story back, I think it was around 2012, maybe closer to 2014, where farmers in the Mid South, as they were switching increasingly into corn, were suddenly spending north of $80 an acre on this one pest, the plant bug, just absurd amounts of money that this plant has caused in its history of the cotton belt. So, those growers back then, by the way, who were spending that much were kind of, in my recollection, Mississippi, some Arkansas Delta, really thick of the Mid South. So, who better to share some insight on this pest than Starkville, Mississippi based Tripp Walker, an agronomic services rep with Syngenta? Tripp recently took some time to shed light on best management practices for this pest with me as we head into 2026, and we are going to bring that interview to you very shortly. But first things first, we are excited to hear from Delta Pine, sponsors and supporters of the Cotton Companion podcast. Delta Pine agronomist Scott Stanislav, he recently sat down with cotton grower custom content lead Hillary Wynn, and they talked about early season management considerations across the belt. We're excited to bring that conversation to you right now.
Hi, I'm Hillary Wynn, Custom Content Manager at Meister Media Worldwide, publisher of Cotton Grower Magazine. Joining me today to discuss early season cotton stand evaluations, key considerations for replant decisions, and practical management options is Scott Stanislav. He is a Delta Pine technical agronomist with Bayer Crop Science in South Texas, spending much of his time in the field working one-on-one with farmers to help them achieve a successful season. With 16 years in the industry, Scott brings hands-on experience and a deep understanding of agronomic challenges faced by cotton growers throughout the season. Scott, welcome to the program.
Thank you. No, I appreciate the opportunity to come and share a little bit of advice today. And been working in cotton my whole career. It is a fun crop. It is a humbling crop at the same time. You learn something new every day, regardless of how long you've been dealing with it. So I'm glad to be here today.
All right. Well, let's help our audience learn something new today. So, Scott, as early planted cotton starts emerging, what environmental conditions do you suggest growers keep in mind as they start to evaluate stand counts across their fields?
So I would say that there's a myriad of conditions that would lead to a successful stand in a cotton crop. And there's a few of them to consider when you're out evaluating a field and maybe having a question around your stand and kind of thinking back to, when it was planted. And really the first thing to think about is your soil temperature at planting. And a good general rule of thumb would be we want a minimum soil temperature kind of in that root zone. So that 2 to 4 inch zone within the soil, a minimum temperature of 65 degrees at planting. Another factor to think about would be kind of your 5-day forecast. We got to look ahead, really, that 5-day forecast from the standpoint of not only temperature, but rainfall. And so we kind of want that steady temperature in that 5-day forecast from the standpoint of no sharp dips up and down. If we get into situations where the temperature dips below 50 degrees, we can start running into some problems when it comes to achieving a successful stand. And so as we think about the first 5 days, a good general rule of thumb is we want a minimum of 25 heat units accumulated in those first 5 days. And you call it heat units, you can call it DD60s, growing degree days. That's kind of all interchangeable terms that we would talk about. And so I get questions about that a lot of times from the standpoint of how do you calculate that or what is a DD60 or a heat unit? It is simply taking your daily average temperature. So your high for the day, adding that to the low for the day, and then dividing that by 2, and then subtracting that by 60. And that will give you that DD60 or that heat unit or that growing degree day for that particular day. And so when we think about those first 5 days, really the minimum there we would want from planting, the day of planting would be 25 heat units accumulated in those first 5 days.
So from these evaluations, what factors do you keep top of mind when suggesting a replant plan?
Yeah, so I think about different times when I've been called out to a grower's farm and, evaluating the stand for a replant decision. And usually the first thing that I would do would be look at the weather since planting, number one, mainly temperature, and figure out, okay, how many, whether it's 8 days, 9 days after planting, whatever it might be, and really calculate up how many heat units have been accumulated on that crop since planting. I think sometimes, depending on planting depth, we look in the literature, it's going to tell you that it takes 50 to 60 heat units accumulated for that cotton to emerge. Now, I think something to keep in mind is that's going to depend on your planting depth. Planting depth can vary greatly across regions of the cotton belt, just dependent upon moisture. A lot of times, at least in the geography that I work, we're having to chase moisture to try to get that cotton germinated. And we can be deeper than what we would think, that 1 to 1.5 inches. A lot of times we were planting deeper than that. And so if we get in a scenario like that, I need to calculate up the heat units up to that point, because a general rule of thumb is for roughly every half inch after or deeper than 1.5 inches of planting depth, you need to add probably at least 10 heat units before you would see emergence. And so that's usually a good starting point when you're out in the field evaluating a field for a successful stand, or whether or not you need to get into start thinking about a replant decision or putting together a replant plan. If that all checks out, there may be another environmental factor in there that has caused the so-called issue or potential issue, and a potential replant. Really, getting out there in multiple areas, obviously, and calculating the span really for uniformity across the field. Cotton's a very resilient crop, and it can really compensate for a thinner stand than maybe what you initially anticipated. And so as we think about or look at a lot of research that's been done over the years, if you have a good uniform stand and there's not a lot of skips in it and it's a lower population, that crop can, with Mother Nature helping out and some differences in management decisions throughout the season, I would say that crop can still provide you a successful yield at the end of the year.
Definitely important considerations when evaluating whether to replant. From a Delta pine perspective, what management options are available to growers as they start making these decisions in the field?
As I think about it from a Delta pine perspective, if we get into a replant situation, which they do happen from time to time, no doubt, really putting a plan together, or talking with your local Delta pine representatives, whether that be your C reps or your agronomists within the area. Here at Delta Pine, we're pretty lucky with having pretty broad portfolio of varieties that fit a lot of different regions. And so, depending upon where you're at in the cotton belt, if you're in a shorter season environment or a more fuller season environment, and depending upon what time of the year or when you're getting it planted and when the replant may happen, some things to think about would be, at least from our perspective, would be, do we need to switch varieties to something that's a little bit more, an earlier maturing variety or whatnot? And so that's going to vary by region of the cotton belt, no doubt. And so obviously I would say if we do get into that situation, that would be something to talk to your local seed rep and or local agronomist about. There's some other things, agronomically speaking. If we're in a shorter season environment and we're getting into the later part of the planting window or a late replant, agronomically speaking, there's some things we can do to speed that crop up, such as planting a little bit higher population and being more aggressive later in the season with our growth management strategy and things like that.
To wrap things up, do you have any final tips or advice for growers as they head out into the fields this year?
Now, as I think about the whole season and growing a cotton crop, it is very reactive in nature, whether that be from a PGR management or growth management perspective, insects, weather, all those kinds of things. We're always reacting to what Mother Nature throws us with a cotton crop. And so I've always said, don't ever quit on a cotton crop. Be timely with growth management, be timely with insect control, be timely with irrigation. If you're in an area that has irrigation, there's no replacement for footprints out in the cotton field. Be out in your cotton fields looking what's going on, or your consultant or agronomist. There's no substitute for actual footprints out in a cotton field. Watching that crop grow and making those management decisions throughout the year. Because I had an old friend of mine tell me one time that if you take care of a cotton crop, it usually takes care of you. That's something that sticks in my brain, because if you stick with it and don't quit on it, it usually takes care of you at the end of the year.
Definitely words to live by. Where can our audience go for more information?
Yeah, so a couple of avenues for more information, from us at Bayer and Delta Pine. Go to our website, cropscience.bayer.us. There's product information on there as well as agronomic information, or contact your local Bayer seed rep and or agronomist.
Scott, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks so much, truly, to Mr. Scott Stanislav of Delta Pine for joining us this week. And of course, to our custom content lead, Hillary Wynn, for leading that interview for us. So we are sitting here in late May as we record, and it has been alternately rain soaked and humid slash sunny and hot here in Memphis for the past couple of weeks and probably around the mid South. Personally, I want spring back. We had a real spring this year, and now it just seems like it was so far away. It's been about 7 straight days of rain here, and we know for y'all's purposes that can only mean one thing, and that is that it is bug pest season. It's going to be right around the corner here in the mid South and across the Cotton Belt as y'all get those stands up and we get further into the season. And that's why we are bringing you an expert in those matters today. That is Mr. Tripp Walker with Syngenta. Tripp, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, glad to be with you.
Yeah, yes, sir. We've been talking here a little bit before we got going, but for our audience sake, can you just tell me, tell our audience what you do there at Syngenta and where you're based out of?
Yeah, so I'm a crop protection agronomist. I'm in Mississippi. I live in Starkville. I cover the state of Mississippi, and then I do have an area of North Alabama that I'm responsible for as well.
Okay, so good portion of our Mid South segment and my home territory. I'm just from Leland down in there, so we could probably play the name game over in that Leland area. Okay, Tripp. Now, just by way of table setting, can you give us a little bit of background on how tarnished plant bugs have emerged as really the biggest thorn in our side, as public enemy number one here in the Cotton Belt?
Yeah, so a couple of different things that I would reference would be, you know, when I started in this business back in the early '90s, we were still growing 1.5 million acres of cotton in Mississippi. Now we're down to less than 400,000 acres of cotton. So we've got a more diverse cropping system mix around where we do grow cotton, a lot of grains. Of course, tarnished plant bugs are pretty much, if it flowers, it's a potential host plant for us. So what I'm getting at there is that one crop is flowering and producing the opportunity for plant bugs to be in there, they can essentially migrate right into the next crop. So oftentimes we see a lot more pressure, like we're in cotton fields or surrounded by corn. So the plant bugs will be feeding on the corn silks while they're still green and kind of attractive. And then as they dry down, they'll migrate right into cotton. So we get these big, heavy migrations into cotton. So that's one of the things that I've seen that's a little bit different than when I first started in this business. So just to kind of the composition, if you will, of how our crops are interspersed with each other. Of course, the other thing is in the cotton side of it, the technology has really addressed some of our primary pests that we had in years past. So if we think about our boll guard technology, for example, is pretty much controlled, or at least has put the emphasis away from our lep type pests. So I'm talking about bollworm, tobacco budworm, that type of thing. We essentially have addressed those with we now have 3 BT events that we plant in our mainline cotton variety. So that's taken away one area of pests that we had, and of course, obviously, boll weevil eradication, before that. So we've taken big sections of pest segments away from what we would typically have to be targeting with, maybe even weekly sprays. And by doing that, we've obviously opened up the door a little bit more for that migration and that steady pressure that we see from tarnished plant bugs.
Yeah, yeah, we're creating a hospitable environment for them with all the corn we got out there here in our home state in Mississippi for sure. Now given spring kind of weatherish conditions or weather conditions, I should say, Tripp, really across the belt, geographically, can you tell us where we're expecting to have some hot spots for tarnished plant bugs in 2026?
To be honest, geographically across the state, I don't really, let me say this. I do see more consistent pressure in our Delta region along the Mississippi River area because we just have got more contiguous crop acres. If you move over into the hills, we do have cotton, but it's more smaller creek bottoms, and it's not as big a blocks of cropping system there. And so the plant bug pressure historically is not quite as heavy when you move east. Those western areas, the Delta counties have a tendency to be a little more consistent. Where we may be spraying 2 or 3 times for plant bugs in the hills, you can basically double that in the Delta and maybe even more than that as far as just the frequency of how often it takes for us to control that particular pest.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I know, Tripp, and I mentioned to you earlier, I just spoke with Doug Roberts in Georgia on this podcast not too long ago, and he was telling me that, the Jacid pest that has emerged in past couple of years really was discovered in, I think, northern Florida first, and then shortly thereafter, Georgia. And it has, in quick order, spread across the Southeast and into the Mid-South. And I would imagine, you've seen some of it in your area too. So we know it's spreading that footprint in areas that are historical kind of TPB, tarnished plant bug areas. So do we have any tips or products that could prove effective in managing both in the same season?
Yeah, and I will say that we didn't see them in Mississippi until very late in the season last year. I know there were some documented down around the Raymond Research Station down there with the Extension Service. Just what I know from winter meetings and talking with Philip and Scott Graham, other entomologists across the university systems that are in those areas, they do seem to be a little more prevalent in the Southeast along the coastal areas. And the same thing that I mentioned earlier about the hills having less tarnished plant bug pressure, that can also be said about much of the Southeast. They don't have near as consistent pressure of tarnished plant bugs. So where I'm going with this is, I think where we make traditional plant bug sprays, and what I'm talking about here is even early season stuff, so like pinhead square, matchhead square, when we're first starting to put reproductive structures on the cotton plant bugs will move in early, and we typically have to address those with our neonicotinoids and some of the older organophosphate chemistries like biodrin and orthene. Those products are very, very effective at controlling some of that first migration in. But those same products are also good at controlling Jazid. So if you're going through the motions of controlling or managing tarnished plant bugs in the Mid-South, I think you're going to get sort of the added benefit of controlling Jazids. But with that being said, we've talked about tarnished plant bug a good bit here. I will make a shameless plug here for a new active ingredient that Syngenta has that we sold on the trade name Vertento. It's a new class of insecticide chemistry. It's a group 30 insecticide. Is that excellent activity on tarnished plant bugs as well as Jazid. At the same time, it has activity on spider mites. So when you think about cotton and what we do here in the Mid-South, we oftentimes when we're targeting one pest, we'll cause another pest to actually flare. And that's certainly the case with spider mites. So I think what you're going to see in the Mid-South is, as we kind of go through our historical methods of controlling tarnished plant bugs, I think you're going to find that Jazids are not going to be much of a problem because we're essentially going to be addressing those as we move along throughout the season.
Yeah, it sounds like I'm hearing you say that the TPB is going to be the first on the scene.
Absolutely. So back to that point, I mean, if you're targeting tarnished plant bugs and you're using a product like Vertento, let's just say, and really peak migration for us is really when we start getting blooms on the plant or even small boll. That's when they get more difficult to control, because if you think about a cotton plant, once it starts putting bolls on, it's getting some biomass out there. Its crop is canopied up, it's closing up the middles. So you've got this kind of shaded environment where the plants are now, belt high to maybe the bottom of your chest high. And so when you start making insecticide sprays on that size or that architecture of that plant, it's hard to get material down in there. And so you really need something that's going to give you a lot of residual control there, because they're constantly moving in and out of the field. And so it's a difficult pest to control, and it takes multiple applications. But again, if we're doing those things, I think you're going to see us controlling that entire spectrum. That would also include Jazids in there.
Very good. Very interesting. Now, we're talking about early arrival. We're talking about them being the first on the scene. Can you tell our farmer audience what are some early kind of warning signs that they should be watching for with tarnished plant bug?
Well, anytime you start seeing reduction in fruit retention, I think our extension recommendation is 80%. And then we're talking about the top 5 nodes in the plant. So as you're scouting, you really want to focus visually on the fruit retention in those top 5 nodes, because obviously that's going to be the most recent fruit that's put on. And really tarnished plant bugs they favor those little small fruiting squares, the little tender, the most tender first fruiting forms that are put on in the terminal there as the plant's growing with its apical dominance. So maintain fruit retention. When you see anything dropping below 80%, you're going to trigger an insecticide spray. And then it just depends on, what other pests might be present in the field as to what, insecticide chemistry you choose. And of course, anything we can do to encourage earliness. So here we're talking about planting rates, fertility, irrigation timing, PGRs or plant growth regulators to try to reduce that canopy from letting it get too vegetative or big. All of those things, of course, earliness, the earlier the crop can be planted and we get it off timely, We don't seem to see quite as much insect pressure when we get the crop out, as timely as we can. So all of those are things that we can do agronomically to try to help manage insect pests.
Yeah, you mentioned that you're talking about cultural stuff our guys can do. And when you talk about early timing, it seems like this year was especially, I mean, these guys could plant as early as they wanted. In a lot of cases, am I, don't let me tell lies though. I mean,
You're
characterize it
actually
that way?
absolutely right. It was a very unusual spring. Actually, toward the end of February, we actually had a stretch in there where we were hitting 90 degrees, for multiple days, and the soil temperature was warm enough that you could even plant soybeans if you just based it off soil temperature. So we had a lot of crop that went in, literally was planted toward the end of February or the very first few days in March. So a lot of our grain crop went in earlier than I've ever seen it. Now the cotton, probably weren't many people that were bold enough to jump out there that early, but we hit a little cool stretch right around the 1st of May, and a lot of people kind of held off. So our cotton crop, at least in my guesstimation, is really more in our normal window when we would typically plant it. So
Yeah.
obviously soil temperature's got to be warmer for cotton to germinate and to emerge. So it's going to be the last crop that we plant. So I'm going to say we've got more of a kind of a normal time frame around most of the cotton acres in Mississippi, where the grain is going to be planted a lot earlier.
I see. Yeah, I would just, it's front of mind for me because I was waiting on my buddies to show up at the Gin Show up here in Memphis on February 28th, and a couple of them didn't make it because they were planting corn. So I was just acutely aware of it at that time.
Yeah, I think you're going to see it's going to be one of the earlier grain crops that we've had in a long, long time because of that window that you're describing right there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, just by way of getting us out of here, Tripp, you've been very insightful here, and I appreciate you. Do you have any practical tips for our guys on how they can stay ahead of this pest here in 2026, as we know that bud pest season is right around the corner?
We mentioned earlier a little bit of just the migration of this particular pest. One thing that I don't know that people pay as much attention to as they should, but I mentioned flowering plants essentially being host plants for tarnished plant bugs, and that also includes plants that grow along your field borders or your ditches or your edges of your field. So managing your field borders is an area that I think we probably don't pay quite as much attention to. And I understand you still got to have, you're controlling erosion and things like that. So waterways or permanent, turn rows and things like that have got all kind of advantages there. But just managing the species that grow along those areas so that we don't have essentially host plants growing right immediately adjacent to our cropping system, particularly when we're talking about cotton. And I know that's difficult to have because you don't want it to just be bare ground, but maybe try to select for more grass type species like Bermuda or something that grows there. Obviously, that's not going to be a problem. It doesn't flower in a way that plant bugs are attracted to, but things like, vetch and Carolina geranium and, just a whole host of things that do grow along our field borders are. And so when those things, mare's tail, I can think of a number of different ways. Pretty much any broadleaf weed that produces a flower can potentially be a host for tarnished plant bugs. So just think about managing your field borders, maybe grassy areas or things that are adjacent to fields. I know a lot of times people will do that with a bush hog. They'll go around and they'll mow those areas. Well, if there's flowering, weeds in there, all it does is just force those pests immediately right back into that field edge, into the crop that's growing adjacent to it. So just maybe thinking a little bit about how you manage those areas would definitely be a tip that I would throw in. We can even use some residual herbicides in there to kind of favor the grasses and kind of select the broadleaf weeds out of there. So there's some things that we can do agronomically that growers would already be familiar with, some of the herbicide chemistries that might work there to try to help manage the species that are present there. And then, of course, going back to my earlier comments, just anything we can do to promote earliness in the crop is going to be to our advantage when we're talking about managing insect pests. The later the crop is, the more susceptible we're going to be to insects, basically targeting those last acres that are still green, So I think those would be my two primary areas, would be field borders and then just earliness in general.
Field borders and earliness. I'm taking notes, man. Tripp, buddy, I appreciate you so much. You've been, audience doesn't know, but you've been flexible with us as we've tried to manage around the holiday here. We're on the backside of a Memorial Day weekend, and you've been great to us, and we appreciate you, sir. And yeah, next time I see you down there in Mississippi, we'll have to catch up, and I'll owe you a beer or owe you a dinner.
Yeah, well, we appreciate it. Glad to help. Just holler anytime.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Tripp Walker, Syngenta agronomist. Thank you. So, all right, that's going to do it for this episode of the Cotton Companion. Thanks go out especially to our sponsor, Bayer Crop Science, and their Delta Pine brand cottonseed. Mr. Scott Stanislav there was the one who joined us. And of course, to our guest on this episode, Mr. Tripp Walker of Syngenta. As always, we want to thank you, dear listeners, for joining us and for your continued support. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode. And if you did like what you've heard, please be sure to spread the word and tell your friends and neighbors about the Cotton Companion podcast. Here's where and how they can find us.
You can find the Cotton Companion in 3 easy ways. First, go to cottongrower.com/companion, or simply click the podcast tab at the top of the homepage. Second, subscribe to our channel on iTunes or wherever you find your podcasts these days. And 3, sign up for our weekly e-newsletter, the Cotton Grower e-News, that's delivered to your email inbox every Tuesday morning. You can do that by going to cottongrower.com/subscribe. Also, be sure to follow Cotton Grower on social media. We are at Cotton Grower Mag on Twitter. And on Facebook, you'll find us by searching for Cotton Grower Magazine.
The Cotton Companion podcast is produced by Tyler Hatch and Kim Henderson, our talented colleagues at the world headquarters for Meister Media Worldwide in lovely Cleveland, Ohio. I'm Beck Barnes, and I'll be back with you in a couple of weeks with the next episode of The Cotton Companion.
'Cause God made me a farmer. Yeah, he works and he works and he works and he works all day. God made a farmer.